It started with fire, steel, aluminum, then copper, cars, pharmaceuticals. The list grew with every tweet. President Donald Trump had declared economic war on Canada, his country's closest ally and largest trading partner. With a 35% blanket tariff on all Canadian imports, Trump believed he had cornered Ottawa into surrender. He expected panic. He expected concessions. What he didn't expect? Silence. But silence is not surrender. Canada didn't panic. They pivoted. While Trump shouted, Canada strategized. And now, months later, it's Trump who came crawling back to the table, asking for talks. Not demanding, not dictating, begging.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't respond with bombast. He didn't hold press conferences or issue angry communiques. He didn't slap on retaliatory tariffs overnight. No, Carney simply did the one thing Trump never could. He thought ahead. While Washington leaned into chaos, Ottawa moved with precision. Behind closed doors, Carney's government launched an economic realignment campaign that shook the foundations of North American trade. Canadian ministers fanned out across Asia, Europe, and South America. Trade envoys from Seoul to Brussels suddenly had Ottawa on speed dial. And in the background, Canada quietly activated bilateral mechanisms buried inside agreements Trump had long ignored. The goal wasn't to win a war. It was to avoid one altogether. Carney made history when he declared the era of automatic friendship with the United States officially over. No more business as usual. No more blind loyalty. No more assuming that just because the two countries share a border, they share economic priorities. That statement landed like a thunderclap across Canada's political spectrum. This wasn't a prime minister looking to pick a fight. It was a leader redrawing the terms of engagement. Canada would no longer play the junior partner to an unpredictable neighbor. They would be sovereign, they would be equal, or they would walk. Tariffs that backfired spectacularly. Trump's 35% tariffs were designed to crush Canadian exports and starve the supply chain. Instead, they backfired in fast. American car manufacturers, relying on Canadian aluminum and auto parts, saw production bottlenecks within weeks. Retail prices for consumer goods spiked. Governors in Michigan and Ohio, already under pressure from unions, called the White House in a panic. Small businesses began to speak out. Even conservative media questioned whether making America great again was worth a 20% markup on imported HVAC systems. By contrast, Canada's economy, while rattled, held firm. The copper tariff? Largely symbolic. Most of Canada's copper exports had already shifted to Asia months earlier. The automotive sector? Shored up through contingency deals with Japan and Korea. Pharmaceuticals? Ottawa issued emergency procurement orders through European suppliers. The result? Trump threw a punch at a wall that had already been reinforced. Canada's strategic silence. One of the most striking features of Canada's response was the absence of rhetorical retaliation. While Trump played to his base with slogans and press spectacles, Carney chose restraint. No name-calling, no grandstanding. Just strategic movement, methodical, patient, precise. Canada used the breathing room to negotiate amendments to the CETA agreement with Europe, fast-track trade enhancements with the UK post-Brexit, and ink fresh memorandums of understanding with South Korea and India. Meanwhile, domestic manufacturing incentives were expanded. Ports in Halifax and Vancouver received funding injections to reroute freight from traditional U.S. entry points. The message was clear. Canada was done playing on a rigged field. Trump realizes he overplayed his hand. It wasn't long before whispers in Washington turned into warnings. Economists flagged the Canadian tariffs as economically unsustainable. Farmers in Wisconsin and Iowa began losing access to Canadian dairy markets. American tech firms flagged potential delays due to disrupted cross-border data protocols. And then, finally, Trump blinked. He didn't announce it on Twitter. There was no campaign-style rally. But behind closed doors, his administration made a quiet outreach. They wanted to restart tariff talks. They wanted to negotiate. The problem? Canada wasn't rushing to accommodate. No more deadlines. No more ultimatums. This time, Canada set the tone. No artificial deadlines. No last-minute flights to D.C. No press leaks or political theater. If Trump wanted talks, he'd have to come with more than noise. Carney's office emphasized three principles: clarity, reciprocity, and respect. No back-channel pressure. No economic threats disguised as diplomacy. Just serious, honest negotiations, or no negotiations at all. This wasn't pride. It was posture. Canada had learned the hard way that appeasing bullies doesn't yield stability. It invites more bullying. So this time, the rules were theirs. Diversification as defense. Central to Canada's new doctrine was trade diversification. The CETA framework of the EU, previously underutilized, was now a cornerstone. Agricultural exports to the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain surged. South Korea and Japan became top destinations for Canadian clean tech and precision manufacturing. In Africa and Latin America, Canadian companies began landing contracts previously dominated by the US and China. Meanwhile, within Canada's borders, there was a shift toward economic patriotism. By Canadian, campaigns picked up steam. Investment in domestic supply chains, especially in healthcare and energy, grew. This wasn't isolationism. It was sovereignty. The domestic Canadian unity factor. What Trump didn't expect, and likely didn't understand, was how his aggression would unify Canada. Political parties that normally spent weeks bickering in Parliament suddenly spoke with one voice. Premiers from provinces as different as Alberta and Quebec issued joint statements. Union leaders and corporate executives, normally at odds, stood shoulder to shoulder. The Canadian media, known for its skepticism, praised Carney's patience. Public polls showed a spike in national pride and a surge in approval for trade diversification. Even traditionally U.S.-friendly editorial boards acknowledged Canada had handled the crisis with grace and grit, a lesson in leadership. The stark contrast between Trump and Carney became a global case study. One wielded threats and drama. The other deployed strategy and silence. And in the end, it was Carney who came out ahead, not because he out-yelled Trump, but because he didn't need to. Trump's desperate call for renewed talks is proof of that. After trying to bend Canada to his will, he ended up being the one to seek a seat at the table. But Canada's not just looking for a deal. They're redefining what partnership means. And that redefinition could reshape U.S. trade relations for years to come. The Canada-U.S. tariff standoff was never just about percentages or product lists. It was a referendum on power, respect, and the future of international cooperation. Trump's tariffs were loud, but Canada's silence was louder. And now, as negotiations cautiously resume, the lesson is clear. In an age of volatility, it's not the biggest voice that leads. It's the calmest mind. Mark Carney's strategy, defined by quiet strength, diversification, and sovereignty, didn't just protect Canada's economy. It charted a path for others to follow. Because sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Canada's response to Trump's erratic trade war was not only diplomatic and strategic, it was transformative. As the United States lurched deeper into transactional nationalism under Trump, Canada began recalibrating its entire economic identity. The era of quietly tolerating backdoor deals and Washington-centric trade frameworks ended. Canada made a loud decision in a quiet way. It would no longer be the default junior partner in North American trade. It would be a sovereign actor on the global stage. Mark Carney's team began executing this pivot immediately. Ministries were instructed to accelerate diversification talks with Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and the EU. These weren't just symbolic deals. They targeted critical industries, agriculture, clean tech, aerospace, and AI, in place of single-point dependency on U.S. buyers. Canada constructed a spiderweb of commercial corridors that could reroute trade flows even under duress. If the U.S. decided to slam a tariff wall down, it would be met with a Canadian economy too nimble, too diversified, and too grounded in global partnerships to feel more than a sting. What shocked observers in Washington wasn't Canada's retaliation. It was the nature of it. No fiery podium speeches. No Twitter meltdowns. Instead, Carney's administration began gradually freezing bilateral trade programs in non-essential sectors. U.S. agricultural inspections were suddenly delayed. Infrastructure permits for cross-border energy projects slowed to a crawl. Behind closed doors, diplomats warned American lobbyists that Canadian support for joint North American ventures would require revised frameworks of trust. It wasn't vengeance. It was leverage. And it worked. By avoiding dramatic retaliation and focusing on pressure points within U.S. regulatory and investment channels, Canada outmaneuvered the White House without giving it a target to punch back at. Within weeks, U.S. business groups began lobbying the Trump administration for clarity and compromise. Governors in Michigan and Ohio publicly questioned the wisdom of antagonizing their largest trading partner. Quietly, the storm began to turn back toward Washington. One of the most jarring moments in the conflict came when Canada announced that U.S. supply disruptions had forced air ambulance services in Toronto to temporarily ground non-emergency flights. The implications were immediate and damning. Trump's economic war wasn't just hitting factories or trade balances. It was putting lives at risk. Canadian media seized on the story, not to sensationalize, but to underscore the absurdity of the situation. A country like Canada, wealthy, peaceful, allied for over a century, was now scrambling for medical equipment because of tariffs designed to punish China. Public sentiment hardened overnight. The approval rating for Trump among Canadians dropped to single digits. But more importantly, it galvanized support for Carney's long-term strategy. Canadians weren't just tolerating economic independence. They were demanding it. As the conflict escalated, one sector became quietly decisive: technology. Canada had already invested billions into becoming a North American AI hub, particularly in cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. By the time Trump's tariffs began to bite, Canada was ready to make a move. Behind the scenes, Canadian officials finalized a partnership with Germany and South Korea for joint R&D in clean energy storage and artificial intelligence. The deal included not only technology transfer, but exclusive early access to certain innovations, skipping the U.S. entirely. For Canadian companies, this meant being part of a protected pipeline of next-gen tech development without Washington's erratic regulatory mood swings. For American firms, it meant watching from the sidelines as their northern neighbor leapfrogged into the future. Trump's administration made a fundamental miscalculation. They confused Canada's civility for weakness. They assumed that threats and tariffs would force concessions, just as they had with smaller economies or divided partners. But Canada wasn't divided. In fact, the more Trump escalated, the more unified Canadians became across party lines. Provincial premiers who rarely agreed on anything stood side by side, condemning U.S. overreach. Labor unions and conservative business coalitions found common ground. Even historically pro-American voices in Canadian media admitted it was time to reevaluate the alliance. By attempting to bully Canada, Trump did something no Canadian strategist could have hoped for. He solidified a national consensus on economic sovereignty. For Canada, this conflict became less about tariffs and more about dignity. Sovereignty wasn't just a matter of international law. It was economic self-determination. Could Canada control its own markets? Could it define its own policy priorities without appeasing a volatile neighbor? Carney's answer was clear: yes. But it would require courage. It would require investment. And it would require telling Canadians the truth. There would be short-term pain. Certain sectors would suffer. Trade flows would shift. But in return, Canada would gain the one thing it had never fully possessed as a trading nation: leverage. By the time the Trump administration softened its tone and hinted at renegotiation, the damage was done. Canada had already restructured. Supply chains had already been rerouted. Global partnerships had already deepened. The Canadian economy didn't collapse. It adapted. When Trump's top economic advisors reached out to re-engage Canada, they found something unnerving. Ottawa wasn't desperate. It was calm, organized, and prepared to walk away. For the first time in decades, the power imbalance between the U.S. and its northern neighbor had evaporated. What happened between Trump and Canada didn't just affect two countries. It sent a message across the globe. Smaller and mid-sized economies began studying Canada's strategy. Nations like Finland, South Korea, and Chile started emphasizing diversification, diplomatic integrity, and regulatory independence. In a world dominated by economic superpowers, Canada's playbook became a model for survival, and for Washington, it served as a warning. Influence in the 21st century wouldn't come from tariffs, tweets, or threats. It would come from trust networks and strategic resilience. Canada's quiet defiance during Trump's trade offensive didn't just reshape a bilateral relationship. It redrew the blueprint for modern economic sovereignty. Where Washington brought bluster, Canada brought patience. Where Trump relied on spectacle, Carney relied on strategy. And in the end, it was the steady hand, not the loudest voice, that carried the day. This trade war wasn't one with headlines. It was one with discipline. And Canada, for the first time in a generation, emerged not just intact, but stronger. As Canada stepped back from its traditional reliance on the United States, it moved with remarkable agility into a new phase of international engagement. The quiet exit from U.S.-centric trade allowed Canada to deepen its ties with blocs and individual nations eager to reduce their own exposure to Washington's volatility. The EU, already frustrated with Trump's tariffs on steel and his withdrawal from climate agreements, found in Canada a stable, dependable partner. Through CETA, the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, Canadian companies gained more favorable access to 27 European markets. Canadian grain, lumber, pharmaceuticals, and tech saw rapid upticks in exports. Simultaneously, the UK, freshly out of the EU, turned toward Canada as part of its global trade rebranding. These moves weren't just economic wins, they were statements. Canada wasn't waiting for Washington to come to its senses. It was building a world without them. One of the understated victories of Canada's strategic repositioning was its focus on protecting its middle class, an idea that gained traction internationally. As American trade policy under Trump became increasingly erratic and punitive, Canadian officials emphasized stability, wage growth, and job security as foundational pillars in trade agreements. For example, Carney insisted on labor provisions in new trade deals that protected Canadian standards while avoiding the race to the bottom that U.S. firms often pursued abroad. Countries like Ireland, Sweden, and New Zealand took notice. Canada's trade diplomacy became not only about GDP and balance sheets, but also about values. And that struck a chord. In an age of growing inequality, Canada offered an alternative to hypercapitalism, sustainable growth through fairness. When Trump first introduced tariffs, he did so from a position of assumed dominance. The U.S. was the largest market in the world, and its leadership believed others would simply absorb punishment until they capitulated. That strategy may have worked in isolated cases, but Canada refused to be bullied. By maintaining its composure and refusing to meet aggression with escalation, Canada flipped the dynamic. Washington soon discovered that other countries, inspired by Canada's defiance, were less willing to negotiate under duress. Trade talks with Japan faltered. European leaders hardened their stance. Latin American nations began forming their own trade pacts independent of the U.S. In trying to isolate others, Trump ended up isolating the U.S. itself. And Canada was the first domino. Mark Carney's most powerful move may have been the one he didn't make: loud retaliation. Instead of participating in Trump's game of threats and counterthreats, Carney and his advisors employed strategic silence. No emotional pressers, no last-minute tweets, just methodical restructuring of Canada's trade web. Behind the curtain, embassies were activated, trade attaches worked overtime, and bilateral deals were inked without press conferences. Carney made himself almost invisible in this phase, allowing the headlines to swirl around Trump, while Canada recalibrated its economy in the shadows. This approach confused Washington. Without a reaction, they had no angle of attack. Without outrage, there was no drama to exploit. It was one of the most effective uses of diplomatic restraint in modern North American history. While Trump peddled a harsh version of economic nationalism, one rooted in exclusion, aggression, and protectionism, Canada presented a different model. Economic patriotism in Canada wasn't about keeping others out. It was about lifting Canadians up. Programs like Buy Canadian First, Subsidies for homegrown green tech and grants for small manufacturing firms positioned economic resilience as a community-driven project. It wasn't Canada against the world. It was Canada joining the world on its own terms. By rooting nationalism in local empowerment rather than international hostility, Canada demonstrated that sovereignty need not come at the expense of diplomacy. Despite the breakdown in relations during Trump's term, Canada never entirely closed the door. Instead, Carney left a window open, a path to reconciliation, but only on equal footing. When the U.S. eventually approached with quieter overtures to renegotiate terms, Canada made it clear, no more automatic compliance. The North America relationship would need rebuilding from scratch. Rules, not relationships, would govern future agreements. This reset not only put the two nations back on a more stable course, but it also signaled to future U.S. administrations that partnership with Canada would have to be earned, not assumed. Years later, as the dust settled and administrations changed, Canada's strategy began to pay long-term dividends. While the U.S. grappled with reputational damage and internal divisions, Canada emerged as a balanced, respected actor in the global economy. GDP growth stabilized, investment returned, universities saw increased international enrollment, tech incubators in Ontario and Quebec flourished, and critically, Canadian voters rewarded Carney's coalition in the next election, offering a clear mandate for continued diplomatic strength and economic foresight. The episode between Trump and Canada wasn't just a regional trade dispute. It was a referendum on how nations respond to coercion. It asked, is it better to shout back or to build elsewhere? Is it better to retaliate or to evolve? Canada chose evolution. It chose composure. And in doing so, it wrote a new chapter in the global trade playbook. One where sovereignty, resilience, and quiet power lead the way. The world took note, and so did history.